My fiancée posted, "Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best futures," the night she called off our wedding. I never responded to the caption or the comments below it. Months later, she deleted the post after watching her mother defend me during a heated family argument. "I think calling off the wedding is the right decision." She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing alone in the car for weeks. Calm, measured, like she was reading from a script she'd finally memorized well enough to deliver without her voice breaking. I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say. I had 7 years of things to say. I had a venue deposit receipt sitting in my desk drawer. I had a voicemail from the caterer from 2 days ago asking about the final head count. I had a ring on her finger that her mother had cried over when I proposed. I had all of that. But I looked at Paisley sitting across from me in the living room we'd picked out together, in the apartment we'd moved into 18 months ago, because we thought it made sense to stop paying for 2 places when we were getting married anyway, and I understood something that I think she expected me to argue against. She wasn't asking. This wasn't a conversation. This was a notification. So I nodded, and I said, "Okay." She blinked. I think she expected more. I think she'd prepared for more, for raised voices, for me to demand reasons, for some kind of scene that she could later describe to Rowan over coffee as the proof that she'd made the right call. I didn't give her that. I said okay, and I meant it in the only way that word can be meant when your entire future is being handed back to you across a coffee table. Not gracefully, not willingly, but with the quiet finality of someone who has already decided that dignity matters more than being right. She left that night to stay with Rowan. I sat in the apartment for a long time after she left. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I didn't go through the stages people expect you to go through. I just sat there in the silence of a place that still had her plants on the windowsill and her dry shampoo on the bathroom shelf and a save-the-date magnet from our own wedding stuck to the refrigerator door, and I let myself understand what had just happened. Then I went to bed. At some point after midnight, while I was lying in the dark staring at the ceiling, my phone lit up with a notification. Paisley had posted, "Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best futures." By morning, it had 47 comments. I read every single one of them, and then I put my phone face down on the nightstand, and I never responded to a single word. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that months later, she would sit in her own apartment in the quiet dark and reopen that same post, and she would read every comment again, and nothing about any of it would feel the way it felt that night. She deleted it before anyone could notice. But by then, it was far too late for deleting things to change anything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. Let me tell you what we were before we became what we are now. We met in the way people meet when they're 24 and still believe that timing is a thing that happens to you rather than something you build. A mutual friend's birthday gathering. Colt had dragged me out because he said I was becoming someone who ordered takeout alone on Saturday nights and called it a personality, and I didn't have a strong enough argument against that, so I went. Paisley was laughing at something across the room when I walked in. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that takes over a person's whole face and makes everyone around them want to be in on whatever the joke was. I spent the next 20 minutes working my way into that side of the room. We talked for 3 hours that night. She was smart in the specific way that made conversations feel like they were going somewhere rather than just filling space. She had opinions about things. She pushed back on ideas she didn't agree with. She was funny without trying to be. I was gone before the night was over. 7 years is a long time to be anything with someone. We weren't perfect. Nobody is, and anyone who tells you their relationship was perfect before it ended is editing the memory in real time. But we were real. We had the kind of history that builds itself quietly, through ordinary Tuesdays and minor disagreements and long drives and inside jokes that stopped making sense to explain to anyone else because the whole point was that they were ours. We got engaged 2 years before the wedding that never happened. I proposed at a place that mattered to her, not me, a specific stretch of a park upstate that she'd been going to with her family since she was a kid. Her father Jed had taken her there every fall when the leaves turned. She'd told me about it early in our relationship, the way people tell you things that are actually them handing you something to hold carefully. I held it carefully. Her mother, Everly, cried. Not the performative kind, the kind that happens before a person can stop it, the real involuntary response to something that catches you off guard emotionally. She held my face in both her hands afterward and said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "You're going to be so good for each other." Everly was a woman who chose her words. She didn't say things for the effect of them. When she spoke, she meant it. Jet shook my hand firmly and said, "Welcome to the family." And I believed him. Our families overlapped in the way that happens when an engagement goes well and both sides actually like each other. There were dinners, holiday gatherings, Everly and my mother texting each other about logistics, and somehow becoming friends in the process. Jet and my father discovered they had opinions about the same baseball era and spent an entire Thanksgiving in a corner talking about it while the rest of us ate. It felt solid. The word I kept coming back to was solid. But somewhere in the year before the wedding, the final year, the one that was supposed to be about centerpieces and rehearsal dinners and all the small decisions that add up to a beginning, something started shifting. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in a house you've lived in for years. Not alarming enough to stop what you're doing. Just present. Just different. Paisley was somewhere else a lot. Not physically. She was there. But the version of her that showed up felt like she was also somewhere else in her head, having a separate conversation with herself that I wasn't part of. I told myself it was wedding stress. I told myself it was work. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative, that the shift meant something I didn't want it to mean, was a thing I wasn't ready to sit with yet. Everly called me one afternoon in the spring, about 4 months before the breakup. She said she was just checking in. We talked about something ordinary for a while, and then she paused in the middle of a sentence and said, "You know, we think the world of you. That doesn't change." I didn't understand why she was telling me that. I thanked her. I said something about getting together soon. We hung up. I didn't understand why she'd said it the way she did until much, much later. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. The post got 114 comments by noon the next day. I know because I read them. All of them. More than once. I'm not proud of that, but I think any honest person in that position would tell you they did the same thing. You read the comments on a post about your own life the way you watch a car accident you were in from someone else's dashcam footage. You can't look away even though looking hurts. Queen behavior. You deserve everything. Proud of you for choosing yourself. The universe has something better waiting. Hardest thing to do, but you're so brave. This made me want to cry. So much respect for you. There were people I didn't know in those comments. There were people we both knew. There were mutual friends who had eaten dinner at our table and attended our engagement party and signed the card that Everly had organized with both family signatures. And they were in those comments talking about brave choices and deserved futures and the universe and its plans. None of them knew what the decision actually was. They only knew the caption. I thought about responding. Not defensively. I genuinely wasn't angry at that point. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because anger requires you to believe that the other person has done something to you, and I wasn't there yet. I was still in the place where everything felt like weather rather than choice. But I thought about typing something. Putting a version of reality into the thread that was actually real. I didn't. Colt called me that morning, and I didn't pick up. Not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I wasn't ready to hear my own voice explaining things out loud yet. He texted, "I saw. I'm here. No rush." That was Colt. He understood that not every moment requires a response. I went to work. I'm still not entirely sure why that was the decision I made, except that going to work meant there was somewhere to be that wasn't the apartment with the plants and the dry shampoo and the save-the-date magnet, and I needed somewhere to be. Gage looked up when I walked in and did the specific thing that good people do when they can see something is wrong. He didn't ask anything. He just said good morning like it was a normal day and handed me the project file we'd been working through together, and I sat down and worked. The comments kept coming throughout the day. I checked once at lunch, then put my phone away. Sometime around 3 in the afternoon, a comment appeared that stopped me mid-scroll when I checked again at the end of the workday. It was from someone I didn't recognize. Not a mutual, not a friend, just someone who had apparently seen the post through someone else's share or interaction. And they wrote, "I hope whoever was on the other side of this decision finds peace. Ending things with someone who loves you is painful for both people, even when it's right." That was all. No emoji. No further sentiment. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Because in a thread full of people celebrating a brave choice, this was the only person who had acknowledged that a choice has two sides. That ending things means ending them for someone. That the future being celebrated in the caption belonged to a person who had just had their future canceled without being consulted. I didn't respond to that either. But I saved it somehow. Not literally, just in the way that certain things settle into you and stay. That comment, that acknowledgement, it didn't fix anything. It didn't change anything. But it reminded me that the reality of what happened existed even if nobody online was posting about it. And that was enough. I went home. I called my mother. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I told her what had happened in the straightforward way you tell someone something when you've had a full day to absorb it, and the shock has settled into something quieter. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, "Come home this weekend." I did, and the post accumulated comments for days, and I never touched a single one of them. Here is what was actually happening in the year before Paisley said what she said in our living room. I was building something. Not in a dramatic sense. Not with a grand plan or a vision board or a declaration about where I was going. I was just working. I had a career that was starting to move in a direction that required real attention, and I was giving it that attention. Long days. Some weekends. The kind of focused, head-down investment in a thing that you make when you can see it going somewhere and you don't want to lose the moment. Maddox had been my mentor for about 2 years by that point. He was 15 years ahead of me in the industry, the kind of person who had already made all the mistakes that I was still making and who was generous enough to tell me what they'd actually cost him rather than the polished version. He'd identified something in my work early, and he kept pushing me forward in ways that required me to show up fully. Paisley wanted us to show up fully somewhere else. That was the tension. It sounds simple when I describe it that way, and maybe it was simple, but when you're inside it, it feels like a much more complicated disagreement about values and priorities and what the other person is actually telling you about who they are. She wanted a version of building that looked like things happening, decisions made, boxes checked, the life assembled according to a timeline that made sense from the outside. I was building something that didn't have a visible shape yet, and she was not interested in waiting for the shape to appear. Rowan had gotten engaged that year to someone whose career was already finished becoming what it was going to be. Stable. Established. The kind of professional life that fit neatly into a dinner party answer. Paisley and Rowan had been best friends since college, and Rowan's version of a future was the version Paisley was holding mine up against without saying that was what she was doing. I knew something was different when conversations stopped going anywhere. Not arguments. We didn't fight much, which I used to think meant we were healthy, and I have since reconsidered. We would talk about things that mattered, and the conversation would end without landing anywhere. I would raise something, and she would acknowledge it, and we would both move on, and nothing would have actually shifted. It was the relationship equivalent of a meeting that ends without a decision. I tried. I want to say that clearly because I think there's a version of this story where I'm the person who didn't try, who was so absorbed in his own path that he missed everything. I did try. I asked the questions. I said the things out loud that I think most people leave unsaid because they're afraid of what the saying reveals. I told her I was aware of the tension. I told her I wanted to understand what she needed. I told her I was in this and wanted to stay in it, and wanted us to figure out together what in it actually meant. Those conversations would end and nothing would shift. At some point I stopped pushing because pushing started to feel like the wrong kind of pressure, like forcing a door that wants to stay closed. I thought I was giving her space. I didn't understand yet that what she had actually been doing for months was arriving at a conclusion quietly, alone, and that by the time she sat across from me on that couch, she had already lived through a version of the conversation I didn't know we'd been having. Everly had seen it. That's the part that stayed with me. That phone call in the spring. "You know we think the world of you. That doesn't change." She had seen something I hadn't. She had seen her daughter moving toward a decision, and she had picked up the phone and said those words to me because she wanted to say them before it was too late for the saying to be uncomplicated. Before it became something she couldn't offer without it feeling like she was choosing sides. She said it when she could still say it cleanly. I didn't understand that until later. But when I finally understood it, I understood a great deal about Everly, and about the kind of person she was, and about why what she did months later affected everyone in that room the way it did. The deposit on the venue was non-refundable. 40%. I know people expect the aftermath to be about the emotional wreckage, and that was real, but there is also something clarifying about the specific material facts of an event like this. The florist had a partial refund policy. The photographer was kind and gave back more than she was required to. The caterer was less kind. The invitations had been sent, but the wedding website was still live for 2 weeks because neither of us had thought to take it down, and several people had apparently visited it and left guest book messages that neither of us had the heart to go delete. So they just sat there on a page that no longer corresponded to anything real. Families were told. That was its own process. Jet called me personally, which I hadn't expected. He was brief and direct in the way he always was, but his voice had something in it that I recognized as the particular difficulty of a father calling his almost son-in-law to acknowledge that his daughter has done something that can't be undone. He said he was sorry. I told him he didn't know me that. He said he wanted me to know that this didn't reflect anything about who I was as a man. I thanked him. That call lasted 4 minutes. Everly didn't call. I assumed she was managing Paisley and didn't have the bandwidth for anything else. I didn't take it personally. My mother came. My father did the thing fathers do where they sit beside you and watch a game and don't say anything specific, but their presence is itself the thing being said. Colt showed up with food one evening and didn't ask questions, and we watched something terrible on television, and that was exactly what I needed. I moved out of the apartment within 3 weeks. There was no negotiation about it. It was her apartment. She'd had it before I moved in, and I was the one who should leave. I found a place quickly, a smaller unit in a building 2 towns over, and I moved my things in stages over several evenings without ceremony. The last thing I took was the save-the-date magnet from the refrigerator. I don't know why. I put it in a box, and then later put the box in a closet and didn't think about it again for a long time. Paisley, publicly, appeared to be doing well. I'm not saying that unkindly. She had her people around her, and the validation was real, and she was moving through it in the way she moved through things, outwardly, with her community visible around her. The post was still up. The comments were still appearing occasionally, weeks later, as people discovered it through friends. She had made herself the protagonist of a story about difficult choices, and her audience was supportive. I was, in that story, a non-speaking background character. I understood that. I didn't try to change it. I had no interest in becoming the angry ex who posts his side, or the wounded ex who needs everyone to know he's wounded, or the righteous ex who needs the public record corrected. None of those versions of myself held any appeal. I had a life to live, and I understood something in those early weeks that I think people expect to take much longer to arrive at. I was going to be okay. Not in the hollow reassurance way that people say you're going to be okay. Actually okay. The kind of okay that comes from realizing that the loss of a specific future, while real and heavy, is not the same as the loss of all futures. I had done nothing I was ashamed of. That was the thing I kept returning to in the quiet evenings in the new apartment. When you can say that about a situation, that you showed up as fully and as honestly as you knew how, and it still ended, there is a kind of peace available that has nothing to do with being happy about the outcome. I was not happy about the outcome, but I was at peace with who I'd been in it. Everyone around Paisley assumed she'd made the right call. They said so in the comments. They told her so at dinners. The narrative was clean and finished and pointed in one direction, and from the outside that must have looked like certainty. For now it was. Maddox had a saying that I'd heard him use a dozen times before I actually heard it. He said, "The best time to build your credibility is when nobody's watching, because that's when you find out if you're building it for them or for yourself." In the months after the breakup, nobody was particularly watching. Paisley's social media audience had their version of events, and I was absent from the narrative, which meant I was also absent from any revision of it. I was not posting inspiring captions. I was not documenting my healing arc. I was not performing resilience for an online audience. I was just working, in the specific, quiet way that work becomes meaningful when it's the only structure you have and you've decided to take it seriously. Gage became important in ways that I hadn't anticipated. We'd been colleagues for a while, cordial, professional, the kind of work relationship that stays on the surface because there's no particular reason for it to go deeper. But around month 2 of the post-breakup rebuild, he came to me with a problem that required exactly the kind of attention I had available, because I had a lot of availability suddenly, and I helped him solve it. After that, he started copying me on things he hadn't before, bringing me into conversations earlier. The professional version of trust is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as access. Maddox noticed the quality of my output shifting. He said it in a meeting in a way that was meant to be heard by the room. This is what focused work looks like. He wasn't performing the compliment. He was pointing to something as a reference point for the others in the room. I sat with that for a long time after. I started running again. Not because anyone told me to, not as part of some prescribed self-care routine. I just needed somewhere to put the energy that had previously gone into a relationship and a future and all the planning that comes with those things. Running in the early mornings in the new neighborhood, before the town woke up, became the container for everything I wasn't saying out loud. Month 3, a project I'd been working on for a year came through in a way that was bigger than expected. I called my mother before I told anyone else. She cried. Not because of the project specifically, but because she could hear in my voice that I was okay in the real way, not the performed way, and I think she'd been waiting for that particular sound. I called Colt second. He yelled something I won't repeat, and then bought me dinner and talked for 3 hours straight about nothing important, and it was the best evening I'd had in months. I didn't post anything about the project, but around month 4, something started shifting in the peripheral conversations I was aware of without being part of. Mutual friends, people who had been squarely in Paisley's corner in the immediate aftermath, which was the correct place to be. I didn't begrudge anyone that started reaching out. Not about the breakup, about other things. Work things, mostly. Questions that were really invitations to catch up, disguised as professional inquiries. Harlow texted me in month 4 asking about something work-adjacent, and we ended up in a 40-minute phone call. She didn't bring up Paisley directly, but she said at the end of the call, in the specific, careful way that people say things they've been thinking about for a while, "I'm glad you're good. I mean that." She meant something by the "I mean that." I didn't ask her to explain it. But Logan reached out around the same time. And Parker. And then someone who had been at our engagement party and had commented on the post in the first week of it going up, congratulating Paisley on her courage, texted me one afternoon to ask about something unrelated and stayed on the phone for an hour asking how I was doing and eventually said, "For what it's worth, I don't think I fully understood the situation at the time." I said I appreciated that. I didn't ask what they understood now. I didn't need to. There is a specific kind of reputation that you cannot manufacture. You can build a public image deliberately. You can curate what you post, manage how you appear, control the narrative that goes out with your name attached to it. All of that is available. But there is a different thing, the reputation that builds in the spaces between what you post, in the way people talk about you when you aren't in the room, in the accumulated evidence of how you actually showed up across time. And that thing cannot be engineered. It either exists or it doesn't. Mine, apparently, existed. I didn't know this in real time. I was just living, working, running in the mornings, calling my mother on weekends, getting better at cooking because I now had to cook for myself and decided that was either going to be an adventure or a punishment, and I chose adventure. Growing my friendship with Gage into something that involved actual personal conversation rather than just work. Meeting with Maddox quarterly and absorbing everything I could. But the conversations kept happening. Not many, not loud, just the gentle accumulation of people adjusting their understanding of a situation as more time passed and more evidence came in. The evidence was simply how I was. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't performing not bitterness, which is a different thing. I've seen people perform it, the studied casual references to their ex, the pointed not mentioning, the elaborately curated absence of apparent feeling. I was genuinely not bitter because I was genuinely occupied with my life, and bitterness requires a lot of attention that I'd redirected elsewhere. People noticed. Not in any dramatic way, but the people who knew me were watching the way people watch someone navigate a hard thing, and what they saw was someone navigating it without performing the navigation. Paisley, from what I gathered through the ambient awareness you maintain of someone you spent 7 years with even when you're actively not seeking information, was also doing her version of fine. She'd been on a trip with Rowan. She'd updated her apartment. She'd posted things, not about the breakup anymore, just the regular content of a life being lived. But the comments on those posts were different. Fewer. More ordinary. The validating chorus that had shown up for the original post had dispersed back into their own lives, and what was left was just the regular engagement of a person's regular social media existence. The extraordinary moment had passed for her audience. Something else was changing too, and I was only partially aware of it because it was happening in conversations I wasn't part of. Everly, from what reached me through careful osmosis, had not been quiet in the months since the breakup. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the private conversations that happened between people who were trying to understand something after the fact. Jet had apparently said very little. He was a man who processed privately and kept his own counsel. But Everly had been asking the questions that women like her ask when they're trying to reconcile what they believed about a situation with what the evidence now suggests. Rowan, apparently, had a harder time in that period than Paisley let on publicly. I don't know the specifics of what was said in those private circles. I wasn't there. I didn't have a source who was reporting back. I want to be clear about that, because I am not someone who maintained a network of informants tracking my ex-fiancée's private life. But things seep through. They always do. The people we're both connected to exist in the overlap, and information, even when no one intends to share it, has a way of moving through that space. A family gathering was coming up. It had been planned for months. One of those seasonal events that the families maintained even after the engagement ended, because the families had become genuinely connected beyond Paisley and me, and the adults involved had relationships that existed independently now. I had been invited. I had almost declined. Colt told me not to be ridiculous, and that declining was the kind of thing that looks like statement making even when it isn't, and I should just go and be exactly who I was and let the evening be what it was going to be. I didn't know, going in, what it was going to be. Nobody did. Everly's house was the kind of place that had a sound. Not a noise exactly, but a particular ambient warmth that you noticed the moment you walked through the door, the combination of something cooking and music at a reasonable volume, and the specific acoustics of a house that has been genuinely lived in for decades. I walked in and was received with the ordinary warmth that the evening required. Jet shook my hand. Everly hugged me, which said something on its own. The others present were a mix of both sides, people I knew from my family's connection and people who had come in through Paisley's. Harlow was there, Logan, Carter, and his wife. A few people I knew less well. Paisley arrived about 40 minutes after me. We were cordial. We are adults with 7 years of shared history and a mutual community and a set of families that had become intertwined in ways that outlasted our engagement, and so we were cordial. We said hello. We moved through the evening in different orbits. This was not difficult or loaded. It was just the thing you do. Dinner happened. The table was full, and the conversation was the kind that happens when a group of people who genuinely like each other gather in a house that holds good memories. Someone told a story. Someone argued gently about something minor. Someone made a toast that was warmly received. And then, as happens at gatherings like this, the conversation shifted into territory that nobody had explicitly planned to enter. I don't remember exactly how it started. Someone, I think it was Carter, without any apparent agenda, made a reference to the wedding that hadn't happened, not meanly, not pointedly, just as a passing acknowledgement of something that had happened in the history of the group. The kind of reference that's meant to glide past, but sometimes catches. It caught. Someone else said something. Then someone responded. And suddenly the room was doing the thing that rooms do sometimes when a topic that has been avoided for months surfaces in a social setting. Everyone was either joining or bracing. Paisley, to her credit, was not combative about it. She said something measured about having made the best decision for herself. A few people nodded in the way people nod when they don't want to take a visible position. Logan said something that was theoretically neutral, but had a shape to it that suggested it wasn't entirely neutral. Rowan wasn't there that night. I noticed it only in retrospect. The conversation got louder in the way those conversations get louder. Not angry. Nobody was shouting, but the kind of louder that happens when people start speaking from feeling rather than from calculation. I was quiet. Not conspicuously quiet. I wasn't performing silence, sitting in the corner radiating restraint so everyone could see it. I just didn't have anything I needed to say. This was a conversation about my life, but it wasn't a conversation I needed to participate in. The facts of who I was and how I'd handled things were present in the room without my narration of them. And then Everly spoke. She had been quiet too, up to that point. The specific kind of quiet that belongs to a person who is listening very carefully and deciding very carefully. And when she spoke, the room noticed, because Everly did not speak carelessly, and everyone in that room knew it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform emotion. But her voice had something in it that made the conversation stop. She looked at no one in particular, and she said, "He treated you better than most people ever will." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a moment acknowledged and moved past. A real quiet. The kind that settles when something true has been said aloud that everyone in the room, on some level, had already understood privately. "I've watched a lot of relationships in this family," she continued, and her voice was steady and her eyes were clear. "I know what it looks like when someone shows up. He showed up. He showed up at the beginning, and he showed up in the middle, and he showed up at the end. And the way he handled the end told me everything I needed to know about who he is as a man." Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. Jet looked at the table. Carter's wife looked at her hands. Harlow looked at me for just a moment, then away. "I'm not saying you were wrong to make the choice you made," Everly said, and she was looking at Paisley now, directly, with the unflinching clarity of a mother who has crossed some internal threshold. "But I am saying that you should know what you had. I think you know. I think you've known for a while." The silence held. Paisley didn't respond. Not because she had nothing to say. I could see the processing happening, the internal weather of someone who has just heard the truth land from a source they cannot dismiss. Paisley could have disagreed with Harlow. She could have argued with Carter. She could not easily dismiss her own mother. Everly sat back. She picked up her glass. She took a sip as if she had simply said what needed to be said and the conversation could now proceed in whatever direction it was going to proceed. It didn't proceed anywhere dramatic. The gathering wound down the way gatherings wind down. People said their goodbyes. Everly hugged me on the way out. Jet shook my hand again. I drove home in the November cold with the heat in the car turned up and the radio off, and a feeling that was not triumph, not even close, but something more complicated and more quiet. Something like being seen by the right person at the right time. I thought about Paisley driving home in her own car. I thought about what that car ride must have felt like. And then I stopped thinking about it, because it wasn't mine to think about. She had her car ride. I had mine. That was the shape of things now. I went home. I didn't post anything. She was alone in her apartment later that night. I know this the way you know certain things about people you spent 7 years with. Not because anyone told me, not because I was watching, but because I know how she processes things, and processing like this she does alone, in the quiet, without an audience. She sat with what Everly had said. She had been carrying something for a long time. I think she had been carrying it since earlier than she'd admitted to anyone, maybe earlier than she'd admitted to herself. The specific weight of a decision made with confidence that gradually, incrementally, begins to feel like something else. Not regret in the clean, cinematic sense. Not the sudden realization that you've made a catastrophic mistake. Something slower. The quiet accumulation of evidence that the story you told yourself about a choice doesn't quite match the story everyone around you eventually tells about the same choice. The comments on the post had said brave. Her mother, who chose every word, had said something else. At some point that night, she opened her phone. She navigated to the post. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best futures. She read the caption. She'd written it in the aftermath of a conversation she'd been rehearsing for weeks, in the particular emotional state of a person who has just done something irreversible and needed to believe it was the right thing. The caption had felt true when she posted it. It had felt like the beginning of a chapter. She scrolled the comments. Queen behavior. You deserve everything. Proud of you for choosing yourself. The universe has something better waiting. All those voices. All that support. All that certainty borrowed from 100 people who only knew the caption, not the man behind it. Not the way he'd called her parents before he proposed to ask rather than inform. Not the way he'd gone to the park that mattered to her instead of the place that was easier for him. Not the way he'd said okay on a couch in an apartment, and not once, not in a single moment across all the months that followed, made her feel like she owed him more than she'd given. She read the comment from the stranger she didn't know I had saved in my own memory. I hope whoever was on the other side of this decision finds peace. She stayed on that one for a long time. I don't know everything that passed through her mind in those minutes. I was not there and I never asked and she never told me. But I know that the validation she had borrowed from 100 strangers and 100 supporters had served its purpose and run its course. And what was left when she looked at those words now was not the brave certainty she'd felt posting them, but something quieter and harder to name. The future she had celebrated in the caption had arrived. It was a regular future. Not bad. Not what she'd expected it to be, but nothing ever is. The universe had not delivered something better in the specific way that caption implied. Life had just continued, the way life continues, with ordinary days and ordinary decisions, and the particular mix of good and less good that constitutes a real existence rather than a narrative arc. She thought about her mother's voice in that room. She thought about Jet's expression when Everly said what she said. She thought about the way the room had gone quiet. She thought about me driving home. And then she pressed delete. Not because anyone had asked her to. Not because there had been any public pressure, any demand, any campaign to take it down. Nobody was waiting for it. Nobody would have even noticed if it had stayed up forever, one more old post buried in the archive of a life's online record. She deleted it because she could no longer believe it. That's the only honest reason. The post was gone before midnight. I found out later, through the ambient awareness I'd maintained without seeking. Someone mentioned it in passing, the way you mention when something small has changed. I nodded. I didn't respond. I didn't feel the satisfaction that I think people expect you to feel in a moment like that. The vindication, the confirmation, the told you so. I just felt the specific quietness of a thing being over. I never commented on the post while it lived. I never reached out after it died. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said by the way things had actually gone, by the months of silence that spoke more than any response could have, by Everly's voice in a room that went still, by a late November night in which a woman sat alone and deleted the caption she'd written for a future that never quite materialized the way she'd announced it would. The future she celebrated online was the same future that eventually made her erase the post. I didn't need to say that. It said itself.